Biblical Figures in Islam, Part 34, New Testament, The Apostles, Part 5, Peter, Part 1, Peter in the Gospels and the Book of Acts. So the subject here will be Peter, the Apostle. But before we get into Peter, just a quick note on where we will be going here. We're not going into all the disciples individually, just the big four, so to speak. We did Paul, and now we move on to the other three, those who knew Jesus personally, and just as importantly, those who led the early church. By that I mean Peter and John and James. And by James, I mean the James who was Jesus' relative, the first bishop of Jerusalem, the epistle of James, not the other James, the brother of John, who was also a church leader in his own right and actually, funny enough, part of the big three in his day. But this is more of a focus on the apostles who left behind written works. And it was James the Lesser who left behind written works. So we're going to be focusing on those three and how the differences between these non-Paul disciples and Islam present an enormous challenge to Islam itself. Because if you remember from previous episodes, these disciples have a Quranic sanction. So these three, unlike Paul, are supposed to be unquestionably righteous men in the eyes of the Quran. And that makes their differences with Islamic orthodoxy much more than mere curiosity, but much harder to dismiss. These are contradictions that, if not explained, they threaten the very foundation of Islam itself. So, yeah, these guys have always been a pretty big deal for Christians, but in a way of speaking, they are arguably just as big of a deal for Muslims. All right, so we will start with Peter, Simon Peter. Now, for those who don't know, his real name was actually Simon. It wasn't Peter. He was a fisherman from Bethsaida in Galilee. Now, Peter is known for having some struggles here and then, most notably denying Jesus 3 times after the crucifixion. But he was the rock. He was a part of the group that was closest to Jesus. He was present at the transfiguration and Jesus' agony in the garden before the crucifixion. Now, Peter was the one Jesus called out onto the water on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus called him the rock on which he would build his church. That's how Peter received his name. Now, Peter is actually a title. It came from the Greek word for rock. The base of the Catholic Church is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, or Vatican City if you like, and it's built on the burial site of St. Peter, who was martyred in Rome. Now, this title is also one of the justifications for the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who is the leader of the Catholic Church. And that authority, according to the Catholic Church, comes from, among other things, this famous passage in Matthew's Gospel. It says, "But what about you?" Jesus asked Peter. "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." So here, with this famous Bible passage where Peter gets his name, you see Islamic problems all over the place. Now, for one thing, you have Peter telling Jesus that Jesus is the Son of God. And even worse, you have Jesus confirming it. And it shows Peter is receiving revelations from heaven, and that the church he will found will be holy, And not just holy for a little while, holy forever. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. That's some pretty big stuff. So, for the biblical Peter to be Islamically aligned, you have to chuck the entire Gospel of Matthew. Now, Muslims would probably like Luke's version of this a little better. Here's the story from Luke 9:18-20. Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. Once Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "God's Messiah." Now that is a bit more Islamic, particularly at the end. No problem with Jesus being the Messiah. But then again, Luke also has references to a divine Jesus all over that story too. So really, that just doesn't quite work Islamically either. It's just not something that you can really wedge into an Islamic worldview with any kind of coherence. And while we're on the subject of all the other gospels, I should mention the Gospel of John would be the same thing, like in an even more extreme way. There's of all the gospels that Muslims could possibly incorporate, John would be dead last on the list. What does that leave us with? I should note, there is also the Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel. I believe we have gone over this before, but Mark is basically the Gospel of Peter, since we're on the subject of Peter here. Now, Peter himself might have been an illiterate, although not necessarily his whole life. But that isn't as huge a handicap as you may think. I mean, this is Islam for Christians, right? Muhammad was an illiterate himself, at least for a while. And how many words do we have from Muhammad today? It didn't really stop him. Same with Peter. The Gospel of Mark is more of a chronicle of Peter's time with Jesus, and the two letters from Peter in the Bible could have easily been dictated as well. So Peter's friend Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, he wasn't just Peter's secretary. He was actually a disciple in his own right, probably one of the extra 70 who were appointed by Jesus to spread the gospel ahead of him. This is mentioned in Luke's gospel as well. He was called Mark the Evangelist. He was called that for a reason. He was evangelizing. Now, whether Mark is considered a disciple in the Islamic sense, that's up for debate. But we don't have any reason to think he would be anything other than a faithful Christian in the mode of guys like Peter. And interestingly, Mark is probably the favorite gospel of Muslims. And if you had to choose one, I'd go with this one. Because from a certain point of view, we have an account of Peter with Jesus. And now remember the story I told you before, where Peter says, "You are the Son of God." That actually doesn't happen in the Gospel of Mark. There's no dialogue, there's no quote where Peter says, "You, Jesus, are the Son of God." But it's hardly perfect for Muslims either, because this account from Peter through Mark has plenty of un-Islamic things in it, even if we don't have that specific episode from Matthew that we started with. From the very beginning, you have the author labeling Jesus as the Son of God, and John the Baptist doing the same, and the centurion does this at the end. And even if you argue that that specific label does not mean divinity, there's plenty of divine-like things that Jesus is doing here as well. He forgives sins. He speaks with authority in the way a prophet would not. He performs miracles like walking on the water that seem to come from his essence, not as the result of a divine prayer. God isn't instructing him either, like he would do with Moses. He just does these things. And of course, Jesus is crucified, something the Quran disputes. So, this gospel, the Gospel of Mark, according to Peter, Islamically speaking, this is also a non starter. So, really, that basically makes all gospels un Islamic. And it's the earliest gospel, at least in written form, which, as I went through in a previous episode, it just really boxes in Islamic apologists who are trying to square, in good faith, the righteousness of the disciples with the Islamic account of what Jesus was and is and did during his life. And it really, really narrows that tiny, or realistically speaking, non-existent window of when Jesus's teachings would have to have been corrupted somehow. If someone is advancing that theory from the Islamic side. So, on that note, we're going to move from the Gospels to the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, I should mention here we have one of the most famous historical facts about Peter, and one that is inherently un-Islamic. And not for any reason related to Christology or, high theology or anything like that. This actually is much more down to earth, almost literally, because this is about pigs. And this comes from the book of Acts, so it's not from Peter himself, but considering what happened at the Council of Jerusalem and what the church became the Greek world and just the whole historical evidence behind it, I think it's pretty safe to say that this actually happened. Now, you may not think it happened literally. That depends on whether you're a believer or not, but whether they believed this happened, I think it's pretty safe to say that, yes, the disciples believed that this happened. Now, I've only given you the subject here, which is pigs, which doesn't seem like a really big deal. But let me emphasize the potential contradiction that is presented here, particularly when it comes to Muslim claims about dietary laws. And a reason why, ultimately, the Muslims simply could not incorporate the apostles' teachings into their religion. That heavy stone of a contradiction, it would have eventually sunk the Islamic ship, so it just had to be thrown overboard. Because Muhammad really, really hated pigs. It's the main subject of Islamic dietary law. Now, some Islamic schools of thought will go into the Jewish direction when it comes to, say, sea creatures without scales, but that's up for debate. You won't really see anything about milk and dairy or anything beyond pork. When it comes to the Muslim dietary guidelines, yes, there are other things about how it's prepared and all this kind of stuff, but the main subject, it's pretty much a distaste for pork. Now, this isn't terribly surprising, given the early Muslim environment. It wasn't by the sea. It wasn't like Nebraska or something. This was just desert for the most part. But in simplest terms, let's just say Muslims don't eat pigs and pig products. That is not halal. It is haram. It is not permissible. It is forbidden. The pig, it's a thing that just comes up often with Muhammad, especially in the Hadith traditions. Muhammad hated pork as much as he hated the concept of Jesus on the cross. So we have that. And yet, Here is one of the disciples, not Paul, one of the originals, someone called a righteous man in the Quran. And here he is, Peter, in at least what I consider to be a historically sound book. What I mean by that is, yeah, you may not believe the miracles, but yes, the author and the characters clearly believed everything they were saying. Here is Peter, and he's having this divine vision that would eventually lead to a Christendom full of ham and pork chops and bacon. I mean, heck, the most common meat associated with Christmas, the birth of Jesus, is ham, the leg of a pig. And this started with Peter, who was basically told that all food was clean. And he was told that by God himself. The book of Acts, chapter 10, verses 9 to 16. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. And he saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. Now, in it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. And then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." And the voice said to him again, a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." Now this happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now the most obvious thing we see here is pork, but it's more than that. Because in typical Christian fashion of those days of Jesus and the early Holy Spirit, it went a step further than you thought it would. Like the way Jesus would say something like, you were told that if you sleep with another woman, you are committing adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust is committing adultery in his heart. It's that kind of next level declaration, that style of thing. This idea that, you know what, I'm taking this to a level you hadn't even considered. Now, this is the dietary version of that. Notice what's in the blanket. It's not a bunch of pigs. It's 4-legged animals. Okay, so really all mammals, basically. And all kinds of birds, too. And that's not too surprising. But I think the key animals in all of this, where you're going to see that next level, it's the reptiles. And not just because reptiles were not kosher by definition, I'm pretty sure. This word that is used in the Greek, it doesn't just mean reptiles. It is sometimes translated as creeping things or something similar, because this is beyond just like frogs and toads. Now that's because the Greek word herpaton, I doubt I'm pronouncing that correctly, it means something that moves by creeping or crawling. The Hebrew equivalent means something that moves with feet that can't be seen. So we're not just talking about snakes here, or turtles, or even whatever reptile you might want to eat. It's beyond that, way beyond that. It's everything. If you want to eat a worm, go ahead. If your stomach can take it, well, so can God. So we have God, through Peter, saying, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. And that applies to everything. Everything is clean. So cleanliness in general, it's now just a physical thing. Cleanliness is not a spiritual thing. Now, food can make you physically sick, but it cannot make you spiritually sick. Now, as Jesus said in Mark 7:14 to 23, this is Mark, Peter's secretary. Still the episode on Peter. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." And when he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach, and then goes out into the sewer?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." This dream was confirmation of that, or perhaps a reminder of it. It's probably something Peter remembered after having that dream, and what he thought of as an exception in certain circumstances became something far, far broader. And this was the moment where the church, for very good reason, I think, made all things permissible. So here you have God, through Peter, a righteous man in Islam, saying all things are permissible, and that the order was coming from God. So you see the problem here. How then can God, 600 years later, come back and say that, actually, no, some of these things are forbidden? It's very hard to reconcile those things. It's not impossible, I suppose, but it's difficult. Now, if you wanted to, you could do it by saying, hey, this was a place and time, and the Gentiles just kind of needed to hear that. Now, you could do that kind of thing. That was forbidden now. It was forbidden then, but now it's okay because God has decided it's time to hold you to a higher standard. That wouldn't be unprecedented either. It's like Jesus did with marriage and divorce, saying, hey, that was then because of the hardness of your hearts, but the true commandment, the ideal here, is that the two become one for life. So the Muslim version of that would have to be either, one, God had placed a temporary pause on dietary restrictions for a few centuries, or, as is more common, two, that didn't happen. Peter never had that dream. God never did that, and the sources that bring us this story are incorrect. Now, this is the argument made from the Islamic side because it has to be. This argument has to be made. Because I think the generally recognized truth here is that if the book of Acts is correct about what Peter is saying here, then logically the Quran is incorrect. Now, they both can't be right. As I've said many times, the Quran's declaration of the disciples as righteous men of God makes this the only intellectual option for Muslim theologians. They have to somehow make the apostles correct, but the stories about them and their testimony about Jesus has to be incorrect. And really, the only way to do that is to take on faith that the histories are wrong, that the Gospels are wrong, that the book of Acts is wrong, that the early church, pretty much immediately upon Jesus' death, was wildly misguided. Now, it's a very difficult thread to get through the eye of the needle there. And this vision of Peter makes it all the more difficult. And not just because it negates the Quranic idea that some food is unclean, impermissible, God doesn't want you to eat it. But there are broader consequences to this concept as well. It's not just about animals. I mean, if you take Peter's vision, You could argue that God is also removing the entire concept of uncleanliness, especially when you combine it with some other Christian concepts, like the Word of God was literally made flesh in Jesus Christ. How could God at any point be unclean? And in this new religion, the body is literally considered a vessel for the Holy Spirit. By new religion, I mean Christianity. The body is considered a holy thing. So how can that be unclean? Like, ever? And if this is true, what does that say about Islamic rituals beyond just diet? What does that say about ritual cleansing? What does that say about the classic idea that women are impure when they're bleeding every month? What does that say about the state of the human body? So, what I'm getting at is that Muslims absolutely have to reject this entire thing. And not just because of the apostle paradox that the Quran sets up, but also some general ideas that could, if applied in certain ways, raise serious questions about many aspects of Islamic practice, about the entire concept of food and other things that are haram or forbidden, and also about the necessity of washing a certain way as part of a prayer. Peter, as we know him, contradicts all of these things and proclaims Jesus is the Son of God and testifies to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and the Trinity. Now, whether he is speaking through Mark or through one of the other gospel writers or through Luke in the book of Acts, Peter is consistently a person with a Christian view of Jesus and a clearly un-Islamic view of Jesus. And as we'll see in the next part on Peter, this extends to the biblical epistles that are attributed to him as well. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.